Welcome to the first talk of today. Why do some children have speech, language and communication difficulties? This is going to be brought to you by Sue Asquith, who is an early childhood consultant. I hope you enjoy it.
Hello and welcome to this virtual expo and this session about why some children might have speech, language and communication difficulties. My name's Sue Asquith. I'm an early childhood consultant. If you haven't yet tracked me down on social media, you can find my closed Facebook group, which is called Sue Asquith Early Childhood Consultant, with the logo like here on the screen and also the logo that's behind me on the virtual background. You're very welcome to join us there. I think there's about 11,000 people in the group at the moment, so more the merrier. And also on Twitter, if you're a Twitter user, at SueAsquith1. Here is my email address. So if you want to get in contact with any questions or training or consultancy requests after the session, please do feel free to contact me there, or you can fill in a contact me box within the website, which is here. I'm also an author of a book called Self-Regulation Skills in Young Children, which you can probably track down on Amazon or in various bookshops. You can download a Kindle version, order a paperback version, or it is available as an ebook to download as well. So I thought I'd start the session today by thinking about speech, language and communication, because obviously the EYFS, in terms of the prime areas of learning, we've got that area of learning called communication and language. But sometimes it's useful to break communication and language down into speech, language and communication. If we think about them as three cogs that are turning round, hopefully the cogs are helping themselves and they're intertwining properly. But maybe if one of them's not rotating round, or maybe one of them is going slower than the others, then obviously this is where some children might have some speech, language and communication difficulties along the way. So first of all, just thinking about speech very quickly as being the vocalized language that we need. When this includes the sounds that we use to make up words. And obviously speech has rules which dictate the order in which sounds can occur. And this will differ obviously in different languages. If we think of the English language, it has 40 different speech sounds, but yet obviously we've only got 26 letters of the alphabet. So straight away we can see there's some very complex things going on here for children to learn to speak, but also when it comes to learning their phonics as well. And obviously different languages have different rules in terms of what speech sounds might go together as well. So really important for us to think about this, and the fact that development of speech sounds is very gradual for our children. So in early years, children don't hear sounds very clearly, or they might hear some sounds more clearly than others. And this speech, the sounds that come online in terms of learning to talk, is a very graduated approach as well. So some children might struggle with saying certain sounds for a while. Hopefully they'll come online, but obviously for some children they might not. Therefore, if we think about what a speech disorder might be, this is the difficulties in to be able to create and form the speech sounds, and it might include articulation, fluency, and also in their voice. So we can think about the muscles and the bones that might be used to make the speech sounds, and sometimes this might result in atypical speech for some children. Also, we need to think about voice disorders here and fluency disorders, which might sometimes result in children stammering or cluttering words and sounds together. So this is obviously a very quick synopsis about what's going on here, but just breaking down the three kind of components, if you like. So thinking about language next. Language is understanding and communicating in various words, which might include words. It might include actually forming some sentences as children obviously are progressing and getting better in terms of their communication and language. They might start to join 2, 3 and 4 words together. But we need to think about how the words will fit together to obviously construct a sentence here. And then the grammar, which obviously is another bolt-on, which more complex skills, thinking about the past, future and present tenses, which is something that obviously is part of the literacy early learning goals, isn't it? And then we need to think about getting the correct grammar, choosing the right words that might go together so that they actually make sense. Then you need to think about decoding, because we need to be able to decode what somebody's asked you to do, or a specific sentence or some information, to then decide on the specific words and the sounds and the sentence construction that we might need to reply. So lots of things here. It might be including spoken words, it might be the way that we write as adults, or it might be through signing if we're not speaking specifically, if we sign instead. In early language, receptive language is greater than expressive language. So if we think about caring for babies, for example, if you said, "Where are your shoes?" a baby might be able to think, "Oh, okay, shoes," and they might potter off and find them for you, but they might not necessarily be able to say, "I found them, Sue, here they are," or something like that to reply. But they've understood and they've gone off and they've found their shoes. And then the expressive language comes after that. So you build up the understanding, you speak to babies and children, build up that kind of understanding and the information so that they've listened to those sounds and they start to babble, and then the words come, don't they? If we think then about the language disorder, and this is about an impairment that is used to understand verbal or written or other language systems. There's lots of different complex names that speech therapists might use here, but sometimes it's developmental and sometimes it happens sometimes through a brain injury or an illness. Communication then is the way we choose to send messages in conversations in a mutually agreed way. And it obviously impacts everybody's life chances in terms of being able to talk about our well-being, our moods, and being able to make friends and socialize with people. But communication's not just about talking. We've got things on here, obviously there's a telephone and that involves talking and listening, but then it might be as we get older that we're sending emails, it might be that we're sending chat messages or WeChat messages or whatever we're doing now to be able in terms of WhatsApp and social media, etc. So being able to use all those kinds of communication skills as well. So let's think about the speech, language and communication needs and the kind of prevalence of them, really. Lots of children will go through transient difficulties, and then others will go on maybe to have a long-term speech, language and communication need. So back in 2006, I think, ICANN gave us their report called The Cost of the Nation of Poor Communication and Language. And in there, they were saying 50% of children might start school with impoverished language. So if we think this is kind of, half of the children really might start school with impoverished language. This is obviously, a huge figure really, isn't it, about what was going on at that time. The same report said that 75% of children might start their early education at 3 with impoverished language. So if this is all the children, 75% of them might start early education at 3 with impoverished language. 50% might start school. So already, obviously, 25% have caught up, if you like. But then there might be 10% of those children that might go on to have a persistent, specific speech, language or communication need. And it's the 1 in 10, the 10% that are going to need the referrals to speech and language therapists rather than the 75 or 50%, which obviously would inundate the systems. And I think maybe the systems are perhaps inundated already with maybe backlogs still from the pandemic, maybe for some of these children to get assessments or help. So loads of things to think about here. The long-term ones, though, are 10%, possibly about 10% of children that will go on to have that longer-term speech, language and communication need. So it's really important that our earlier staff, our practitioners, our childminders, our preschool practitioners, etc., are trained in speech, language and communication, to try and think about how we can support that, and thinking about how you're building your curriculum to be able to support speech, language and communication as well. So we can see what's typical and we notice what's atypical, and then we can start some of those targeted approaches that we sometimes start in early years as well. So now let's think about, why do some children have speech, language and communication difficulties? And in just half an hour, this is really impossible to kind of dig in deep and find out a little bit more about it. But let's try and just talk about some examples. So it could be genetics, or it could be something that's happened or hasn't happened pre-birth as the fetus is developing. It could include hearing disorders. So obviously, if children don't hear clearly, they're not going to be able to hear the speech sounds that they're going to need to learn to babble and to talk. Maybe they hear some sounds or some pitch of sound better than others. Maybe it's like glue ear and hearing infections that are intermittent. So sometimes they can hear clearly and sometimes they can't hear clearly. But if you've got hearing disorders or ear infections or middle ear infections or glue ear or what have you, then clearly that's maybe going to go on to impact children's ability to listen to speech sounds and then to be able to talk clearly as well. There might be some very specific stuff going on in terms of difficulties using your oral muscles to be able to make some of the speech sounds as well. There might be central auditory processing disorders, obviously go on to affect the speech, language and communication as well. There might be a recognised condition or a syndrome that might be impairing children's speech, language and communication. Then we think about the communication and the environments. There's a 30 million word gap that some research has highlighted. It's quite old research now. I think it was 1995 or 1998. Hart and Riesling did a study that would say that by 3 years old, the difference between the children that live in a household where lots of communication takes place and the difference between the children where maybe the household doesn't communicate as much is potentially 30 million words difference. And if we could think of culture capital, think about building experiences, talking, sharing experiences, going to the seaside, going to the library, going to the park. If all those things haven't happened, there's going to be a 30 million word gap, but actually the impact on culture capital is going to be quite huge as well, isn't it? There might be speech delays. There might be some development language disorders. There might be anxiety or some selective mutism going on here as well. Lots of speech and language therapists look for and work with people, not just children, but people who have apraxia of speech. So this is where your brain knows what it wants to say, but the pathways between your brain knowing what you want to say and being able to get your mouth to say the things and talk and say the sounds is impaired. And obviously some children might have this, but then if we think about adults who maybe have gone and had a stroke or something like that, that might obviously have impaired those as well. And also the stuttering and stammering, which sometimes children do in early childhood because their brain is going faster than their mouth in terms of they want to talk and they can't find the words that they're wanting and they get quite frustrated maybe about it. But obviously this also could go on to be a longer term speech, language and communication need as well. And then I've put etc. because obviously this is not an exhaustive list of what's going on here. In early years, we need to make sure that we're supporting children by being skillful communicators. We need to be aware of how we are influencing the children in terms of how they learn to talk, what they learn to talk about, how they might pronounce certain words and things. We need to be able to be really good at modelling speech, language and communication, modelling good listening skills, maybe modelling new words, maybe looking carefully skills if we're using visual timelines or if we're signing or we're using the picture exchange communication systems as well. We need to keep our communication age and stage appropriate. I've been in so many settings now where they're trying to tell a story to a group of 2-year-olds just before lunch, or just as other staff are tidying up to do something else. And the 2-year-olds aren't ready for that huge story and that amount of text. And then they disengage, they're not listening. We need to keep everything age and stage appropriate. And again, this is where practitioners' understanding of speech language and communication and what's typical at certain ages would come into force really quickly. If suddenly I started speaking a different language to you, and it's a language that you didn't understand, how long would you be engaged in this webinar for before you were bored because you completely don't understand a word that I'm saying? And it's same for children at certain ages and stages, isn't it? We need to try and make it relevant, make it fun, give them clues, get them interacting with it. And then obviously if they're listening in time, they might be able to understand more of what's going on as well. I am ECAT trained, Every Child a Talker trained, and we use tips for talking in that project here in Kirklees, which were really, really useful. And you can download the tips for talking, and I'm sure they're still there. So you can maybe do an internet search of them, and things like getting their attention before you start to talk, being able to understand that children's watching their eye gaze, following their interests, and being able to talk about what's caught their interest. Loads of really, really useful tips for talking, which you can maybe introduce to staff teams one at once, maybe over a period of time, and also get parents used to them as well, and introduce them to parents in newsletters maybe as well. We need to think about communication-friendly environments. There will be children with sensory processing difficulties where they are going to be super sensitive to sound, to light, to taste and textures and all sorts of things. But we need to make sure that as far as possible, our environments are communication friendly. I know lots of you now are working or have worked in the past in reducing the stimulus of loads and loads of colour going on in your environments, which does help children to concentrate. It does help them to, obviously, there's less distractions, there's less kind of a yellow wall and a red wall and what have you. You know, there's less of that going on to distract the children from what's going on. Sometimes cosy corners and reading nooks and things, just smaller areas where children can retreat to communicate and have a chat with their friends maybe. Really important to think about time and space and thinking time for children, because obviously I'm doing this webinar quite quick. It's quite fast paced, isn't it? Try and get all the information in my allocated 30 minutes. But if we think of children, they need to be able to listen to what you've said, process it, think about what you've said, understand what's said, think about the answer to what the feasible answer, think about the words, send the communication, the networks from their head, from what they want to say, to their mouth in terms of moving their mouth and doing the speech sounds to make the words and things. And sometimes there's quite a big delay there. Sometimes children need 10 or 15 seconds to be able to think of what you've said, understand it, kind of almost translate it in their head to what they would like to say, find the words and talk. So if we think about 10 or 15 seconds, it's quite a long time to be quiet, isn't it? I think that was about 10 seconds. It obviously could have been 15 if I'd counted to 15 in my head. But again, just thinking about how quick the time's going. But thinking about, that was quite a big pregnant pause, wasn't it? But you'll find that some of the children, if you give them the time, will come back with a response. If they don't, recasting the information is important. So think about repeating it. It might be that you might want to repeat it back very specifically afterwards, so it's using the same words again. Or it might be that you might want to maybe think out loud for that child instead. We need to obviously model the correct pronunciation and the correct pronunciation and recast that if necessary, so that if a child says potato, for example, you could say, wow, yes, it's a potato. And then you might be able to say, are you having lunch, or do you like potatoes? But if you repeat it correctly and then just carry on, the child will have the opportunity to listen to the full word and hopefully at some stage be able to, obviously it's a big word, isn't it? But be able to break that down, listen to it, and then maybe be able to talk and be able to say it properly as well. Objects of reference are really important. They could be for children with speech, language and communication needs. It might be if they're delayed. It might be if they're learning English as additional language, or maybe they have autism or another condition that might affect their communication and language. So points of reference, some real things. Do you want to put your wellies on? And you're showing them actually some Wellington boots, not a photograph. I mean, sometimes photographs work, but sometimes children are very literal. And if they've got a need or a delay, that's obviously adding to complex things that might be going on, then actually showing them an actual pair of Wellingtons or an actual coat or whatever it is that you're trying to show them is useful to do as well. And then we need to value children's non-verbal communication and actually ours as well. So as I'm sat here, I'm obviously sometimes raising my eyebrows, although you might not be able to see them because of my big fringe at the moment. But sometimes you raise your eyebrows and sometimes I'm going like this with my hands. So sometimes it's important to think about the non-verbal communication. Children, you'll be able to tell by their face whether they're sad or whether they're happy, whether they're withdrawn or anxious. And if we think about following eye gaze and things like that, there's a lot of non-verbal communication that we can model or take on board from the children as well. And then when I'm in settings, I often have a lot of people wanting a lot of questions, and they're asking lots and lots of questions, sometimes needless questions. We need to think about how we're going to help this. So sometimes asking lots of questions interrupts children's thought process, their creativity, etc. And sometimes asking too many questions means the children are just going to walk away from you and find something else to do. And a corner of your setting that hasn't got an adult that's shooting questions at them all the time. So sometimes narrating about what's going on. Wow, you've got the red pen. Or not just yes and no questions. Sometimes open-ended questions are useful if you want to check understanding of children. But sometimes also thinking, do you remember actually when we did this last time, the last time it rained, what did we need when you go outside? Obviously, it needs to be age and stage appropriate. Too long sentences obviously are not useful for smaller children, but just don't think that you have to be asking questions all the time, modeling new language. If a child says one word, giving 2 words back, etc., is all useful stuff. And obviously if we think about how they're hearing and understanding, and so hopefully then they may go on then to say the words correctly as well. If we think about that 30 million word gap that I referred to a couple of screens ago, and also if we think about the EYFS statutory framework, we know that we've got a duty to help parents to support their children's learning at home as well. So we know that evidence is saying that what happens at home is really important and is a factor in children's success at school and indeed in life. And various bits of research talk about the home learning environment as being important to intellectual and cognitive development, and what parents do with their children in terms of bedtime stories, walking at the parks, going to the libraries, things like that, is more important than actually who they are in terms of their job and their role. So, or just as important, depending on what you're doing, obviously. But it's really important for us to think about how we helping parents with this. I know from working on various different projects, including working with a project in a children's centre several years ago now, that it doesn't come naturally to parents to talk to their children. And sometimes they don't understand that they need to speak to their children in order for them to be able to understand what's going on and to be able to listen to the speech sounds and create their words. And often if we help them to understand what we already know and maybe give them some a tune and the words to a new song that you're going to be singing with the children, or maybe a YouTube clip for somebody singing it, or maybe record yourself singing it, so that then they can maybe repeat that at home and join in with their children at home. And there's lots of really tiny useful things that we can do to help parents to understand what they can do at home as well. So that was about, I think, 30 minutes, which is what I needed to speak to you about. But we do need to obviously think if there are any questions at this stage. If there are any questions, if you'd like to ping them into the Expo team, and they can perhaps forward them on to me as well. If you've got any comments or feedback about the session, then again, please let the Expo team know and they will pass those on to me as well. So in terms of speech, language and communication, we need to think about that overall curriculum, don't we? If we think about how are we helping the children in an age and stage appropriate way, how are we, maybe as leaders and managers, helping our staff? We need to think about how we are providing the training courses for them, the knowledge, the CPD, the mentoring, the buddying, and the coaching, whatever you need to do to carry on improving the knowledge of staff so that they can do their job as well as they can. If we all understand speech, language and communication and what's typical, then we are also by default learning what's atypical. I think both Birth to 5 and Development Matters, since the revised EYFS, have done a lot for practitioners to understand maybe more about it, because even though we all knew and loved the original Development Matters document in 2012, it didn't say by 18 months listen for so many words and by 2 listen for so many words. And now practitioners are reading that information to support and guide their knowledge of child development. Then maybe we're able then to spot the children that might not be reaching those particular milestones. Also worth thinking, typical development, and there's a huge difference, isn't there? I've supported several children whose parents were maybe a little bit concerned that they weren't speaking as much as their peers, but actually by the time they decided to talk, there was maybe a little bit of a delay in terms of this coming out, but actually they were understanding and you could see the cogs turning, and actually when they did start to talk, all was well. So we need to obviously put this into context as well, but being mindful if we are supporting the children that aren't following that typical path of development, thinking about the targeted approaches, the small things that you could do to make a huge difference to these children. And then if the 10%, if you're looking after one of the 10% of children, that you're spotting more complex needs, that you know how to make those referrals in to the speech and language therapists, or referring them to the health visitors, obviously. Some of these things get picked up maybe on 2-year-old progress checks, but then sometimes in some areas, parents are receiving questionnaires or maybe a Zoom or a FaceTime or something, so they're not actually getting that face-to-face progress check or healthy child check with the health visitor and the child as they would have done pre-pandemic. So therefore, our role as early years practitioners is enhanced and more important to be able to spot signs that children maybe are not developing typically, and then we can maybe get the parents to speak to their GP or health visitor, or we can put the referrals into the speech and language therapist for an assessment. Usually local authorities have got a local offer on their websites, and that's probably a useful place to start in terms of your local authority. What is available to you and how can you make these referrals on as well? So please do ping any questions that you might have from today's session into the delightful Expo team, and I'm sure they'll let me know. Or remember that my contact details were at the beginning of the session, and you can contact me via my website in the contact me boxes, or you can email me directly. Thank you for listening. I hope this has been really useful for you, and I hope to see you more at the face-to-face expos or virtual ones in the future. Thank you.